At my son's wedding, they replaced my seat with a trash can and told me it was just a joke. I smiled anyway. I had arrived early that afternoon, dressed in a soft lavender suit I had picked out months ago, the same shade Ryan once said made me look like spring. I remember standing outside the venue, a renovated barn just outside Asheville, the kind with white wooden beams and string lights draped across the ceiling, taking a moment before walking in. I told myself this was a happy day. My son was getting married. Whatever distance had grown between us over the past few years, today was supposed to bridge it. Inside, everything looked exactly as Brittany would have wanted: elegant, curated, every detail intentional. The scent of fresh peonies filled the air, and soft instrumental music played through hidden speakers. Guests moved about with champagne flutes, laughing, adjusting ties and dresses. I spotted a seating chart near the entrance, printed on a large acrylic board. My eyes scanned for my name, expecting to find it near the front, somewhere close to Ryan. Instead, I found it near the back corner of the reception area. Table 12. That was fine, I told myself. Maybe it was just logistics. Maybe there was a reason. I followed the layout, weaving between round tables dressed in ivory linens until I reached mine. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. The other seats were simple white chairs with soft cushions. Mine wasn't. In its place sat a small metal trash can, the kind you'd find under a desk, lined with a clear plastic bag. It was positioned exactly where a chair should have been, tucked neatly under the table, as if it belonged there. I stood still for a moment, my purse hanging from my arm, my fingers tightening around the strap. I looked around, expecting someone to step in, to laugh and say it was part of a setup, that a real chair was coming. Instead, I heard a soft chuckle behind me. "Oh, you found your seat," Brittany said, her voice light, almost amused. I turned to see her standing there in her white gown, flawless, radiant, every inch the perfect bride. A few of her bridesmaids stood nearby, watching. "It's just a joke," she added with a small shrug, as if explaining something harmless. "Don't be so dramatic." A couple of them laughed, not loudly, just enough to be heard. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but my face didn't change. I looked at her, then at the table, then back at her again. Ryan was across the room, speaking with someone from the caterer. He didn't look over. Not once. For a second, I wondered if he knew. Then I realized it didn't matter. I placed my purse on the table carefully, smoothing the fabric of my jacket with my free hand. "Of course," I said quietly. "A joke." My voice sounded steady, even to me. Brittany smiled, satisfied, and turned away, her dress sweeping behind her as she rejoined her circle. I pulled the trash can out slightly and lowered myself onto it, adjusting my posture so I wouldn't lose balance. It was colder than I expected, the thin metal pressing through the fabric. Around me, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Someone nearby complimented the floral arrangements. No one said anything about the woman sitting on a trash can at her own son's wedding. I folded my hands in my lap and looked toward the front of the room where the ceremony would soon begin. From a distance, everything still looked beautiful. Perfect, even. I smiled, just as I had when I walked in, and kept my eyes forward. I stayed there longer than I expected, long enough for the initial wave of curiosity around me to settle into something quieter, more deliberate. People noticed. Of course they did. But noticing is not the same as intervening. A woman at the next table glanced at me twice before leaning closer to her husband, whispering something behind her glass of champagne. He followed her gaze, his expression tightening for just a second before he looked away, as if eye contact might pull him into something inconvenient. I adjusted my posture slightly, keeping my back straight, my chin level. The metal beneath me shifted with a faint sound, subtle but sharp enough that I felt it echo louder in my own ears than it actually was. I folded my hands more firmly, anchoring myself in the moment, reminding myself that dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you decide to keep. Across the room, I watched Ryan laugh at something one of his groomsmen said. His head tilted back slightly, that same familiar gesture from when he was a boy, when laughter came easily and without calculation. For a brief moment, I saw him as he used to be, running through the backyard with scraped knees and bright eyes, calling out for me to watch, to see what he could do. I used to think that version of him was permanent. That no matter how much life changed him, there would always be a part of him that remembered who stood beside him from the beginning. But now, as he stood there in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car, he did not look in my direction. Not once. The ceremony began shortly after. Guests were asked to take their seats, and I remained where I was, already in place. The officiant stood beneath a wooden arch wrapped in white roses, speaking in a calm, practiced tone about love, commitment, and the joining of two families. I listened carefully to those words. The joining of two families. It was a beautiful phrase, one that suggested inclusion, warmth, a blending of lives and histories. But as I sat there, slightly lower than everyone else, the edge of the table pressing lightly against my knees, I realized that some families do not merge. Some are rearranged. Others are quietly pushed to the margins. When Brittany walked down the aisle, every head turned toward her. She carried herself with confidence, each step measured, each smile perfectly timed. People admired her. I could hear it in the soft murmurs, the way they described her as stunning, graceful, perfect. I studied her expression as she approached Ryan, the way her eyes flickered briefly across the crowd, scanning, assessing. When her gaze passed over me, it did not pause. Not even for a fraction of a second. It was as if I were part of the furniture, something already accounted for and dismissed. I did not look away. I kept my eyes on her until she reached the altar, until she took Ryan's hands in hers and the officiant began the vows. There was a moment, somewhere between the promises and the exchange of rings, when I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger. Not exactly. It was quieter than that. More precise. Like a realization settling into place after being ignored for too long. I thought about the months leading up to this day. The phone calls that became shorter. The decisions made without me. The polite but distant tone in Brittany's voice whenever she spoke to me, always careful, always controlled. I had told myself it was normal. That children grow up, that they build their own lives, that distance is simply part of that process. But sitting there, feeling the cold metal beneath me, hearing the quiet laughter that still lingered at the edges of the room, I understood that this was not distance. This was intention. When the ceremony ended and applause filled the space, I joined in, my hands moving together in a steady rhythm. I smiled again, just as I had before. Around me, people stood, hugging, congratulating, moving toward the newly married couple. I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the crowd to move first. It gave me time to think, to observe, to listen. Someone behind me said, "I cannot believe she actually sat there," followed by a soft laugh. Another voice responded, "Well, she did not want to cause a scene." That word lingered with me. Scene. As if dignity required silence. As if respect had to be earned by enduring humiliation without objection. I finally stood, careful and controlled, placing my hand lightly on the table for balance before stepping away from the seat that had been assigned to me. I did not look back at it. Not yet. Instead, I smoothed my jacket once more and walked toward the reception area, my steps measured, my expression unchanged. From the outside, nothing had shifted. But inside, something had become very clear. The reception unfolded with the kind of polished elegance that photographs well and feels hollow if you look too closely. Glassware caught the light, waiters moved in quiet patterns, and a soft jazz melody drifted through the room as if it had been carefully selected to smooth over any discomfort. I moved among the guests at an unhurried pace, offering small smiles, nodding politely when someone met my eyes, though most chose not to linger. Conversations shifted subtly when I approached, voices lowering, topics changing, as if my presence required adjustment. I had seen that before. Not just today. This was not new. It only felt sharper now because I could finally see it clearly. A woman I recognized from one of Brittany's bridal showers stepped toward me with a hesitant smile, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "Everything looks beautiful, does it not?" she said, her tone carefully neutral. I nodded. "It does." My voice remained even. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me, as if considering whether to say more. In the end, she did not. She offered another quick smile and moved on, leaving behind a faint trace of perfume and unspoken thoughts. I continued walking until I reached a quieter corner near the windows, where the late afternoon light filtered through the glass and softened everything it touched. From there, I could see the head table where Ryan and Brittany sat, surrounded by their closest friends. They looked comfortable, at ease, as if the day had unfolded exactly as planned. I watched Brittany lean in toward Ryan, whispering something that made him smile. He reached for her hand without hesitation, his attention fixed entirely on her. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. It told me where his focus was, where his loyalty had settled. I did not resent that. A marriage should come first. I had always believed that. But there is a difference between building something new and erasing what came before. I turned my gaze away and let it drift across the room, taking in the details I had overlooked earlier. The seating arrangements, the place cards, the subtle hierarchy in how guests had been positioned. Family members on one side, friends on the other, with certain individuals placed closer to the center, closer to importance. I traced the layout in my mind, piece by piece, until a pattern began to form. My placement had not been random. It had been deliberate. Carefully considered. I thought back to smaller moments over the past year. The time Brittany had suggested moving Thanksgiving dinner to a restaurant, only to choose one that required reservations she never made for me. The birthday call that came hours late, brief and distracted, as if it had been squeezed into a schedule already too full. The conversations where my input was acknowledged but never acted upon. At the time, each instance had seemed insignificant on its own. Easy to excuse. Easy to dismiss. But standing there now, with the music playing and laughter echoing around me, those moments aligned with a clarity that felt almost clinical. This had not started today. Today was simply the most visible expression of something that had been building quietly for a long time. I reached for a glass of water from a nearby table, the cool condensation dampening my fingertips. I took a slow sip, allowing the simple act to ground me. Across the room, a group of guests gathered near the dance floor, their energy light, their movements relaxed. Someone called out to Ryan, urging him to join them. He hesitated for a moment, then stood, adjusting his jacket before stepping away from the table. As he moved through the crowd, he passed within a few feet of me. For a brief second, our eyes met. It was not a long moment. Just enough for recognition to flicker between us. I offered a small smile, the same one I had worn all day. He returned it, but there was something uncertain in his expression, something that did not quite settle. Then he looked away, his attention pulled back toward the group waiting for him. The music shifted, the tempo rising, and the room responded accordingly. Laughter grew louder, movements more animated. I remained where I was, still and composed, watching as the celebration continued around me. There was a strange clarity in that stillness. A sense that I was no longer trying to fit into the rhythm of the room, but observing it from just outside its reach. I set the glass down and smoothed my jacket once more, a familiar gesture now, one that helped maintain the appearance of calm. Inside, however, something had already begun to reorganize itself. Not with urgency, not with anger, but with precision. I understood now that what had happened at the table was not an isolated act. It was a statement. And statements, when left unchallenged, have a way of becoming truths in the minds of those who witness them. I was not interested in arguing with what had been done. I was interested in what would come next. And for the first time that day, I felt a quiet sense of direction begin to take shape. The first toast began just as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden lines across the floor, and I found myself standing closer to the edge of the room than I had intended, half in the light, half outside of it. Glasses were raised, voices softened, and attention shifted toward the center where Brittany's maid of honor stood with a confident smile and a carefully prepared speech. She spoke about love, about destiny, about how Brittany had always known exactly what she wanted and never settled for less. The room responded warmly, with nods and laughter in all the right places. I listened without interruption, my expression unchanged, though one phrase lingered longer than the rest. Never settled for less. It was said as admiration. as praise. And perhaps, in a way, it was. When the speech ended, there was applause, followed by another toast, this time from one of Ryan's friends. His tone was lighter, filled with stories from college, moments of recklessness and humor that painted Ryan as someone easy to admire, easy to stand beside. I watched as Ryan laughed, relaxed, comfortable in the version of himself being presented to the room. It was not inaccurate. Just incomplete. As the evening continued, I moved again, this time toward the hallway that led to the restrooms and the smaller private rooms used by the venue staff. It was quieter there, the music softened by distance, the conversations reduced to a low murmur. I paused near a partially closed door, not intending to listen, only to collect myself for a moment away from the center of things. But voices carry differently in quieter spaces. Brittany's voice was unmistakable. "I told you she would not make a scene," she said, her tone low but steady, edged with something close to satisfaction. Another voice responded, one of her bridesmaids. Still, the trash can was a bit much. There was a brief pause, followed by a soft laugh. "It made the point," Brittany replied. She needed to understand boundaries. Boundaries. The word settled heavily, not because of its meaning, but because of how easily it had been reshaped. There was a rustling sound, the shift of fabric, the quiet clink of something being set down. "Ryan said it was fine," the other voice asked. "He does not like conflict," Brittany answered. "He knows it is easier this way." Easier. I stood there for a moment longer, not moving, not reacting outwardly, allowing the conversation to pass through me without interruption. There was no shock in what I heard. Only confirmation. The door opened a few inches more, and I stepped back just enough to remain out of sight, my presence unnoticed. Their conversation moved on to something else, lighter, less significant. I did not stay to hear it. Instead, I turned and walked back toward the reception, my steps measured, my breathing even. The music grew louder again as I re-entered the room, the warmth of the crowd wrapping around me as if nothing had shifted. But something had. The pieces that had felt scattered before were no longer separate. They had aligned into something clear, something structured. This was not carelessness. It was design. I returned to the main area just as dinner was being served. Plates were placed in front of guests with practiced precision, servers moving in synchronized patterns that made the entire process look effortless. I took my seat again without hesitation, adjusting slightly to maintain balance, my movements controlled, deliberate. Across the room, Ryan caught my eye once more. This time, he held the glance a fraction longer, as if considering whether to approach. For a brief second, I thought he might. But then Brittany leaned toward him, saying something I could not hear, and the moment passed. He turned back to her, and whatever hesitation had surfaced disappeared just as quickly. I picked up my fork, my hand steady, and began to eat. The food was well prepared, balanced, thoughtfully arranged, like everything else in the room. Around me, conversations resumed, laughter rising and falling in gentle waves. No one mentioned what had been said in the hallway. No. One acknowledged what had been done earlier. It was as if the entire evening existed on an unspoken agreement to maintain appearances, to preserve the illusion that everything was as it should be. I understood that kind of agreement. I had participated in it for longer than I cared to admit. But understanding something does not require accepting it. I placed my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the plate, a small, precise gesture that mirrored the clarity forming in my thoughts. This was not about reacting to a moment. It was about responding to a pattern. And patterns, once recognized, offer something valuable. They offer direction. I lifted my glass of water and took another measured sip, my gaze steady as I looked across the room, not searching for anyone in particular, but seeing everything more clearly than I had before. The music softened again as the evening moved forward, shifting from structured moments into something more fluid, more relaxed, but I remained exactly where I was, grounded not by comfort but by clarity. I watched as plates were cleared and replaced with small desserts arranged with careful precision, each detail maintained as if perfection could compensate for what had already been set in motion. Across the room, laughter continued, and Brittany leaned back in her chair, her posture loose now, confident in the success of the evening, confident in the narrative she had built and everyone else had agreed to follow. I studied her quietly, not with resentment, but with a kind of measured understanding. She had not created this dynamic alone. She had only shaped it, refined it, made it visible. The foundation had been laid long before today. I let my gaze drift away from her and settle instead on Ryan. He was speaking to someone older now, one of the extended family members, nodding politely, smiling at the appropriate moments. He looked composed, but there was something else there too, something just beneath the surface that did not fully settle. A hesitation. A flicker of awareness that he was not entirely at ease, even if he could not yet name the reason why. I recognized that look. I had seen it in him as a child when he knew he had done something wrong but hoped it would go unnoticed if he stayed quiet long enough. I wondered briefly if he remembered those moments too, or if they had been replaced by more convenient versions of himself over time. I reached for my glass again, then paused, my hand resting lightly against the cool surface. There was a time when I would have approached him, when I would have stepped into that uncertainty and tried to resolve it, to bridge whatever distance had formed. But that instinct felt different now. Not gone, but quieter, more restrained. There is a point when reaching out no longer restores connection, it only reinforces imbalance. I lowered my hand and let the glass remain untouched. A server passed by and offered to refill it, and I declined with a small shake of my head. I did not need anything more. Not tonight. My attention shifted again, this time toward the edges of the room, where staff moved in steady patterns, adjusting details that most guests never noticed. It was in those quiet movements that I found a strange sense of alignment. Systems function best when every part knows its role. When boundaries are clear. When responsibilities are understood. What I had witnessed earlier was not a misunderstanding of roles. It was a reassignment. And I had accepted it for far too long without question. That realization did not bring anger. It brought something far more useful. It brought focus. I placed both hands flat against the table for a moment, feeling the solid surface beneath my palms, grounding myself in something tangible, something real. Then I slowly stood, not drawing attention, not interrupting anything around me. The room continued exactly as it had, the music playing, the conversations flowing, the evening carrying on without pause. I stepped away from the table and began to walk, not toward the center this time, but toward the quieter hallway I had visited earlier. The same door remained slightly ajar, the same muted space just beyond it. I did not stop there again. I had already heard what I needed to hear. Instead, I continued past it, toward the exit that led outside. The air shifted as I stepped through the door. Cooler, lighter, carrying the faint scent of grass and evening dew. The sounds from inside softened behind me, replaced by a quiet that felt more honest than anything I had experienced in the past few hours. I paused just beyond the threshold, looking out across the open space where the last of the daylight lingered. In that stillness, everything felt simpler. Clearer. I was not being pushed out. I was stepping away. There is a difference, and it matters. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, holding it for a moment without unlocking it, letting the weight of it settle in my hand. There were things that needed to be done. Not impulsively. Not emotionally. But deliberately. Carefully. I slipped the phone back into my purse and took a slow breath, the kind that settles deep and steady. Behind me, the celebration continued, untouched by my absence. Ahead of me, the path was quieter, less defined, but entirely my own. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a decision. I did not rush back inside. I let the evening air settle around me, steady and unhurried, as if time itself had slowed just enough to give me space to think without interruption. The sound of laughter drifted faintly through the closed doors behind me, softened now, distant, like something I had already stepped away from in more ways than one. I walked a few steps further from the building, my heels pressing lightly against the gravel path, each step measured, deliberate. There was a bench not far from the entrance, partially shaded by a tall oak tree, and I moved toward it without hesitation. I sat down carefully, smoothing my jacket once more, though there was no one here to notice. Old habits do not disappear easily. They simply become quieter. I looked down at my hands for a moment, noticing how still they were. Not tense. Not trembling. Just still. That surprised me more than anything else. There was a time when something like this would have unsettled me deeply, would have sent me searching for explanations, for apologies, for some way to restore what had been disrupted. But that impulse had faded somewhere along the way, replaced by something far more grounded. I was not searching anymore. I was observing. And now, I was deciding. I reached into my purse again, this time without hesitation, and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up softly in the dimming light, reflecting back a calm expression I barely recognized as my own. I unlocked it and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. It had been there for years, unchanged, quietly waiting, much like everything else I had set aside without urgency. I pressed call and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ring on the other end. It did not take long for the line to connect. Helen, the voice said, warm but direct, familiar in a way that required no explanation. I was not expecting to hear from you tonight. I allowed a small pause before responding, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention. I know, I said evenly. But I believe the timing is appropriate. There was a brief silence, the kind that comes from someone choosing their next words carefully. Is everything all right? He asked. I looked out toward the fading horizon, where the last traces of daylight were slipping quietly away. Everything is clear, I replied. And that is exactly what I needed. Another pause, shorter this time. I assume this is about the arrangements we discussed last year, he said. It is, I confirmed. I would like to move forward. There was no need to elaborate. He understood. He always had. Very well, he said after a moment. I will begin the process first thing in the morning. There are a few documents that will need your signature, but I can have everything prepared quickly. I nodded, though he could not see me. I will make myself available, I said. And I would prefer discretion. A soft exhale came through the line, not quite a sigh, but something close to acknowledgement. Of course, he replied. You have always handled these matters with care. Care. The word settled differently now. It no longer felt like something given freely. It felt like something managed. Directed. Thank you, I said simply. There was nothing more that needed to be said. We ended the call without prolonging it, without unnecessary words. I lowered the phone and held it in my hand for a moment, feeling its weight, its quiet significance. This was not an emotional reaction. It was a decision made with full awareness of its consequences. I slipped the phone back into my purse and leaned back slightly against the bench, allowing myself one slow breath. Behind me, the music shifted again, the rhythm picking up as the evening moved into its final phase. I could imagine the scene without seeing it. The dancing, the laughter, the carefully captured moments that would later be shared, edited, remembered in ways that smoothed over everything else. That was fine. Let them have that version. I was no longer concerned with how this day would be remembered by others. I was only concerned with what it had revealed to me. I stood after a moment, steady and composed, and turned back toward the building. Not to rejoin the celebration in the way it had been before, but to complete what had already begun. There are moments in life that do not ask for a reaction. They ask for a response. And those are the moments that define everything that follows. I stepped back inside without hesitation, the shift from cool evening air to the warmth of the reception immediate but no longer overwhelming. The music had grown louder, more energetic now, and the dance floor was filled with movement, laughter rising in waves that felt almost rehearsed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I moved through the room with quiet precision, no longer observing as someone uncertain of her place, but as someone who had already decided it. A server passed by carrying a tray of champagne, and I selected a glass without breaking stride, holding it lightly between my fingers as I continued forward. My steps led me not to the edges this time, but toward the center, toward the space where visibility mattered. Conversations softened as I passed, not entirely stopping, but shifting just enough to acknowledge my presence. I did not look directly at anyone for long. I did not need to. Awareness travels without eye contact. When I reached the head table, I paused just long enough to be noticed. Brittany saw me first. Her expression held for a fraction of a second, something unreadable passing through it before she replaced it with a practiced smile. "Helen," she said, her tone smooth, measured, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Ryan turned next, his posture straightening slightly, a subtle adjustment that spoke more than words ever could. "Mom," he added, quieter, less certain. I inclined my head gently, acknowledging both of them without urgency. "The evening has been very well arranged," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to be heard without drawing attention beyond the immediate circle. Brittany's smile widened slightly, encouraged by the surface of the compliment. "Thank you," she replied. "We wanted everything to be perfect." I let a small pause settle between us, just long enough for the word to linger. "Perfect." Then I continued, "It is interesting how clarity often comes from moments like this." Ryan's gaze shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face again, deeper this time, harder to ignore. Brittany's expression remained composed, though her eyes narrowed just slightly, as if measuring the direction of the conversation. "I am glad you feel that way," she said. I lifted the glass slightly, not in a full toast, but in acknowledgement. "I do," I answered. "Clarity is valuable." There was nothing confrontational in my tone, nothing sharp. Only certainty. I allowed the silence to stretch for a moment longer before lowering the glass again. "I will not keep you," I added, turning slightly as if the conversation had already reached its natural end. Ryan hesitated. "Mom, if there is something you want to say," he began, his voice trailing just enough to reveal the tension beneath it. I looked at him then, fully, holding his gaze with a steadiness that did not waver. "There is," I said softly. "But this is not the time for explanations. It is a time for observation." The words settled between us, not heavy, but deliberate. Brittany shifted beside him, her posture tightening almost imperceptibly, her control still intact but no longer entirely effortless. I gave them both a final nod, a gesture that carried more finality than farewell, and stepped away before either of them could respond further. As I moved back into the flow of the room, I became aware of the subtle shift in attention that followed. It was not dramatic, not immediate, but it was there. Conversations resumed, but with a different tone, a different awareness. People notice when something changes, even if they cannot name it. I returned to a position near the dance floor, standing just outside the movement, watching as Ryan was pulled into the center by his friends, laughter returning to his face, though not quite as freely as before. Brittany joined him a moment later, her expression composed, her movements controlled, but her attention no longer entirely anchored in the celebration. It flickered outward now, scanning, assessing, adjusting. I took a slow sip from the glass in my hand, the cool liquid grounding, steady. This was not a confrontation. It was not a scene. It was a shift. A quiet one, but unmistakable. The kind that does not demand attention, but commands it over time. I set the glass aside on a nearby table and smoothed my jacket once more, the gesture familiar, controlled. There was nothing left to prove in this room. Only something left to complete. And I intended to do it without raising my voice, without breaking the rhythm of the evening, without becoming what they had expected me to be. The evening moved toward its final hours with a kind of polished momentum, as if everything had been timed down to the last detail, and I allowed myself to follow that rhythm just enough to remain part of the picture without being absorbed by it. The dance floor filled and emptied in cycles, laughter rising and falling like something rehearsed, predictable, safe. I remained just outside of it, watching, not with distance, but with intention. There is a difference between being excluded and choosing where you stand. And by now, my position was no longer uncertain. A member of the venue staff approached me quietly, her posture professional, her tone respectful. "Excuse me," she said softly. "There is a gentleman asking for you near the entrance." I inclined my head slightly, not surprised, only acknowledging that certain steps tend to follow once others have been set in motion. "Thank you," I replied, my voice even, and turned without urgency, moving through the room with the same measured pace I had maintained all evening. As I passed the tables, I noticed small shifts in attention again, subtle glances, conversations pausing just long enough to register my movement before continuing. The awareness had spread, quiet but present, like a current beneath the surface. When I reached the entrance, I saw him standing there, exactly as I expected, composed, observant, carrying a slim leather folder in one hand. He nodded once as I approached. "Helen," he said, his tone calm, familiar. I did not want to intrude, but I thought it would be best to ensure everything was in order. I gave a slight nod in return. "I appreciate your discretion," I said. He handed me the folder without ceremony, no unnecessary explanation, no drawn-out gestures. Inside were the documents we had discussed, prepared efficiently, precisely as promised. I opened it briefly, scanning just enough to confirm what I already knew. The structure was clear. The adjustments were definitive. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. Just a quiet redirection of what had once been assumed. "Everything is prepared for your signature," he added, his voice low enough to remain private. "Once completed, the changes will take effect immediately." I closed the folder gently, holding it with both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, not as a burden, but as a confirmation. "That will be sufficient," I said. There was no hesitation. No second thought. He gave a small nod, understanding without the need for further detail, and stepped back, allowing me space. I turned slightly, aware of the open line of sight from the reception area. Brittany had noticed. Of course she had. Her attention had been searching for disruption ever since I returned inside. Now she saw it. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough to recognize that something was shifting beyond her control. Ryan stood beside her, his expression less composed than before, his focus no longer anchored in the celebration. I did not call them over. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened the folder again, removed a pen from inside, and signed where it was required, each motion steady, deliberate, final. There was no audience gathered around me, no dramatic pause, no announcement. But visibility does not always require volume. Some actions carry their own weight without explanation. I returned the pen, closed the folder, and handed it back to him. "Please proceed," I said. He accepted it with a brief nod. "It will be handled," he replied before stepping away, his presence as quiet in departure as it had been in arrival. I remained where I was for a moment longer, allowing the simplicity of the action to settle. Then I turned back toward the room, meeting Ryan's gaze across the distance. This time, he did not look away. Not immediately. There was a question there now, unmistakable, edged with something close to concern. Brittany stood beside him, her posture controlled, but her eyes sharper, more focused, as if trying to calculate what had just occurred. I did not offer an explanation. Not yet. Instead, I gave them the same calm, composed expression I had maintained all evening, the same quiet presence that had allowed everything else to unfold exactly as it had. Then I stepped forward, re-entering the room fully, not as someone uncertain of her place, but as someone who had already decided what that place would be from this moment on. The music continued behind me, steady and bright, as if nothing of consequence had taken place, as if the evening could carry on untouched by decisions made quietly at the edge of the room, and for a moment I stood there, letting the distance between sound and meaning settle into something I could fully understand. Ryan began to move toward me, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a kind of hesitation that had finally found direction. Brittany followed half a step behind, her posture composed, her expression controlled, but there was a tension now that had not been there before, something sharper beneath the surface of her confidence. They stopped a few feet away from me, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain the illusion of ease. "Mom," Ryan said. Again, his voice lower this time, more careful, as if he were choosing each word before it left him. "What was that?" I looked at him fully, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that required no performance. "A decision," I replied simply. The word seemed to settle heavier than anything else I could have said. Brittany's gaze shifted briefly to Ryan, then back to me, her tone measured when she spoke. "If this is about earlier, it was just meant to be light-hearted. You know that." I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said next carried exactly the weight it needed. Yes, I said. I understand what it was meant to be. Ryan's shoulders shifted slightly, a subtle sign of discomfort that he could not quite hide anymore. Then why does this feel like something else? He asked. I held his gaze for a moment longer before responding. Because intention does not erase impact, I said calmly. And patterns do not disappear simply because they are explained. Neither of them spoke immediately. The music behind us rose and fell, laughter continued, but within that small space, there was a stillness that felt separate from everything else. Brittany straightened slightly, her control returning in measured layers. You are overthinking this, she said. It was one moment. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her words without agreeing to them. It was not one moment, I replied. It was one moment that made everything else visible. Ryan exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the back of his neck, a familiar gesture, one I had seen many times before when he felt cornered by something he could not easily resolve. So what does that mean? He asked. I answered without hesitation. It means I have adjusted accordingly. The simplicity of the statement seemed to unsettle them more than anything else. Brittany's eyes narrowed just slightly, her composure still intact but no longer effortless. Adjusted how? She asked. I looked at her, then back at Ryan, my expression unchanged. In ways that do not require immediate explanation, I said. You will understand in time. There was no anger in my voice. No raised tone. Only certainty. Ryan's gaze held mine for a moment longer, searching, perhaps, for something familiar, something that could soften what he was hearing. But I did not offer it. Not because I could not, but because it was no longer appropriate. After a moment, I stepped back slightly, creating a small but clear distance between us. Tonight is your celebration, I said, my tone steady. You should return to it. Brittany opened her mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, choosing silence instead. Ryan hesitated, then gave a small nod, though it carried more uncertainty than agreement. We will talk later, he said. I met his gaze one last time. Perhaps, I replied. It was not a refusal. It was not a promise. Just an acknowledgement that time moves forward whether conversations happen or not. I turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled movement I had carried throughout the evening, and walked toward the exit once more. This time, I did not pause. I did not look back. The doors closed quietly behind me, and the sound of the celebration softened again, fading into something distant, something no longer mine to navigate. The night air greeted me with a steady calm, the kind that does not demand attention but offers clarity to those who are ready to receive it. I walked toward my car with measured steps, each one grounded, each one certain. There was no rush. No hesitation. Just movement forward. As I reached the door, I paused briefly, my hand resting lightly against the handle, and allowed myself one final thought, not shaped by anger or regret, but by understanding. Some people believe that dignity is something you defend loudly. But I have learned that it is often something you reclaim quietly. I opened the door, settled into the seat, and closed it behind me with a soft, final sound. The engine started smoothly, the headlights cutting a clear path ahead. And without looking back, I drove away, leaving behind a place that had already made its position clear, and stepping fully into one that I had finally chosen for myself.